Hey y'all, Matt here with another Bible video. Today we're going to talk about patience, and to this video we're going to actually look back to the Old Testament and look at examples of people that had to be patient in the Old Testament. And Friday we're going to go to the New Testament and do the same thing there. But before we dive into this, I just want to take a second to remind you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell to turn on notifications so you're notified when I post a new video, and please share the channel with your friends so we can get more subscribers. So patience is something none of us like, but we all face it at some point in our lives. Whether we're waiting on God to tell us to do something or waiting on God to finally reveal something to us, nobody likes waiting. But all throughout Scripture, it actually shocked me. We see people that are constantly made to wait and to be patient. And sometimes God uses this as a way to basically for them to display their faith in the promise that God had made. The first example we're going to look at is Abraham in Genesis 12 through 21. As you know, Abraham was handpicked by God to make this covenant to turn into the nation of Israel. And God actually told Abraham that he was going to take him and his offspring, and he was going to make them numerous as the stars. He was going to bless them beyond belief, but there was a problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah were barren. They didn't have any kids. And so how can you have descendants without kids? God made Abraham wait 25 years before he fulfilled this promise that he gave him. And Sarah actually got pregnant with Isaac, the promised child that God had told Abraham he was going to give him all along. In this waiting period, Abraham actually got so impatient. Abraham and Sarah actually, Sarah gave him his handmaid, or her handmaid Hagar, and he actually had another baby with the handmaid to try to solve this problem himself because he got impatient in his waiting, and it caused all kinds of problems for him. Go back and look in Genesis and read it for yourself. So here we see Abraham had to wait 25 years, but God kept that promise after 25 years. Number two, we see Jacob in Genesis 29. Jacob waited and worked for 7 years for the woman that he loved, Rachel. He had an agreement with Rachel's dad, Laban, basically for him to work 7 years, and then he would get her hand in marriage. He works the 7 years, and he tricked him, and he switched out sisters. So what did Jacob have to do? Because he loved her, he worked another 7 years. So he had to wait a total of 14 years for the woman that he loved to finally be able to marry Rachel. That's Genesis 29. Number three, the story of Joseph. Genesis 37 through 46, we see Joseph is basically hated by his brothers because his father is basically obsessed with him and kind of ignores the other ones. And then to make it all worse, Joseph comes to his older brothers and basically says, hey, I had this dream and I'm going to rule over y'all one day. And so he didn't win any popularity contests. His brothers sold him into slavery. But God had better plans for him. He actually moved him up in the leadership in Egypt and placed him in a position of prominence, so when a severe famine hit Israel, he had enough food saved that he could actually keep his father and his brothers alive and give them food. But during this time, from when he was sold into slavery and when we see him being able to fulfill this promise and take care of his family, he faces all kinds of trials over a number of years, and at one point he even stays in prison for 2 years and is forgotten about. So Joseph was incredibly patient, and he faced all of these trials over the course of his waiting patiently. Number three, Moses. We all know the stories of Moses in the Old Testament, but what we forget oftentimes and overlook sometimes is that Moses actually waited 80 years to be able to take the people out of Egyptian slavery. That's right, 80 years that they had to wait between the time that Moses was born and the time that he actually would deliver his people from Israel. And that's a long time. And then once they finally were, led out of Egypt by Moses, they had to wait another 40 years before they could enter the land that God had promised to give them into Canaan, because of some lack of faith on the part of Israel. So in total they waited 120 years for this promise to be basically to be removed from Egypt and for Israel to become its own nation in its own land. 120 years they waited. The next example, number 4, we see King David. We all know the stories of how great King David was, but oftentimes we forget about how he started. Saul was the king before David. Saul was the king that the people chose. David was the king that God chose. But even after God chose David to be the successor of Saul, David had to wait patiently for Saul to be removed from the office. Even during this waiting, after he was even told by the prophet Samuel he was going to be king, David had numerous chances where he could have killed Saul. He could have taken this plan into his own hands and sped up the process a little bit. But what did David do? David respected God's plan, respected his timing, respected that timeline, and he waited patiently, and just like God told him, eventually Saul was killed and David took the throne. But it was in God's time that he allowed that to happen. And then another time that we often forget, lastly, this is the 5th one, we often forget that at the end of the book of Malachi, the last prophetic book in the Old Testament, we see these prophecies, pointing towards some kind of a true David, king ruler that is perfect. He's like David, but he doesn't have the human flaws that David has. And Israel is left patiently waiting for this king to come. They're living in oppression in the foreign lands, under the rule of other people. They're not even their own nation. And we see the book of Malachi end with this promise of this Messiah. And then there's actually a 400-year period between the book of Malachi in the Old Testament and the first book of the gospel, between the birth of Jesus Christ. This is often referred to as the intertestamental period by scholars, or a lot of Jews like to call it the 400 silent years, because it was 400 years that they had to wait silently, where God didn't make any revelations. He didn't send any prophets to them to tell them what was going on, to update them on his plan. And he didn't reveal anything new. There were no new scriptures between then and the birth of Jesus. And so that was a 400-year period that these people were left waiting, not even a nation. They're just scattered amongst their neighbors that had taken over. And so, if anything, these 5 examples from the Old Testament should remind us that sometimes we have to wait. God's timing is better than our timing. And being patient pays off, to wait for him to do what he tells us he's going to do. Because God is always going to be faithful. Sometimes it's just not on our timing. We have to be patient, we have to be prayerful, and we have to wait and try to be obedient in the last thing that he told us to do. But until Friday, when we jump into the New Testament version of this, how to be patient, and people that have been patient in the New Testament, until then, I hope y'all have a great week. If you have any suggestions for videos, there's an email in the description. Please send me an email with suggestions for videos you'd like to see. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share with your friends, and I'll see you on the next one. I love you guys. Blessings.